You are listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Katie Rader, and today I'm joined by Dr. Dennis Culhane, who is the Dana and Andrew Stone Chair in Social Policy at the School of Social Policy and Practice here at Penn. Dr. Culhane is a social science researcher with primary expertise in the area of homelessness and assisted housing policy. Dr. Culhane joined us earlier in the fall as a panelist on a conversations event that the Andrea Mitchell Center hosted called Why Pilots Matter, Penn's Responsibility to Public Education and Community Justice. The recording of this event is available on the center's website for those who might have missed it. We've invited Dr. Culhane back to share his thoughts on the university's recent announcement of a $100 million donation to the School District of Philadelphia to be distributed over the next 10 years. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Culhane. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm wondering if we can just start with your reaction to Penn's announcement last month.
Well, I actually was a little surprised. I didn't expect to get the announcement. As you know, the administration didn't really engage at all with the faculty and students who were advocating for the pilots. And requests for meetings and such were rebuffed. So I think many people felt that this was not really in the plans for the administration. So it did come as a bit of a surprise, and a pleasant surprise.
I think surprise was also my reaction to the announcement as well. Do you have any sort of suspicion? This has been one of many campaigns for Penn to pay pilots since they stopped paying these contributions to the school district back in the 1990s. Do you have sort of a sense of what might have shifted? Why now?
Well, I think that the pressure from the faculty and students certainly was, I think, pretty important. I'm not sure that this would have happened without that pressure. So I think that the administration clearly was hearing these calls, and I think that the various rationales that had been offered were persuasive, that, being the largest private institution and the largest private nonprofit landowner, that, we do have an obligation, as I think many of the folks advocating for this were saying, we do have an obligation to consider how we can support important public institutions who rely on property taxes here in Philadelphia, especially education.
Great. And I want to get back to your relationship and sort of what I think is a very important point you've made about the demand for pilots and perhaps a bit of a critique. But before we get there, I think one of the reactions I wanted to start with, because I think it helps unpack what this issue is, one of the reflections and things that's being debated currently in response to Penn's donation is whether this $100 million donation over 10 years is the same thing as pilots, is the same as the university paying pilots, whether this is a similar demand or what the differences are. If you have some thoughts and reflections on that.
Well, I know that the people who were advocating for pilots had said something on the order of $40 million was what they felt was the fair share contribution based on, some projected total tax liability if the land were taxed. I can't verify those calculations. But I think that the point I was making was that, there are many functions of the university that really aren't part of its, nonprofit mission of service, research, and education. And specifically, I was pointing to the fact that the dorms, the dining halls, and the fitness centers really are operating more like private member clubs where people pay fees to support facilities that provide services only to them. And that, these facilities aren't open to the public. They don't really serve any community benefit. And there is a designation in the tax code for a 501c7 that is for member-only clubs. And the difference between that and the 501c3, which is the designation for universities, is that they pay property taxes. I don't know what the full tax liability would be for the dining halls and such, and then dormitories. But I suspect that $10 million is coming close to what that would be. It would be interesting to have that calculated out, especially if you consider that it's only 40% of the property tax that goes to the school district. So I think that the $10 million is substantial. I would note, by the way, that the pilots, the law that governs nonprofits has a provision for pilots, and that institutions can locally negotiate a payment in lieu of taxes as well. So it is a provision of the law.
So I think that's really helpful and sort of gets to the two core pieces of this, which your suggestion that you're raising and that you also raised in the September event is one of the challenges of this nonprofit tax exemption status which Penn has, because it is classified as a 501c3, is this broad tax exemption. Now, exactly like you're saying, it's somewhat difficult to calculate what kinds of functions there might fit what you're saying as being more appropriately labeled a 501c7. But I wonder if you could talk about it on the other side. What is it that justifies Penn having this tax exempt status? And as you argued in September, you argued this might need revisiting in the case of Pennsylvania state institutions.
Well, I mean, certainly the law is quite specific in terms of there has to be a substantial contribution to very needy and destitute populations and such, but even given that provision, historically a broad set of activities have been justified as meeting the standard of making a benefit to the community. And at the university, education is considered a benefit to the community, and therefore it's covered for the nonprofit. The health services that are delivered through the hospital and the health system, which include providing care for indigent populations and uninsured people, and the research mission, which is based on knowledge development to benefit the overall society and the advancement of society and science. Those are all considered consistent with a demonstrable benefit to the community, even if we might not say that all of those things are providing a demonstrable benefit to our local community. Obviously, healthcare being the big exception. So that's historically what has been covered by the community service obligation. But it's quite a stretch to argue that, just because things are happening on our campus, like students sleep here and they eat here and they exercise here, doesn't mean that those functions are meeting that standard of a community benefit. Now, mind you, the university segments lots of different activities on campus for which some of them they pay taxes. For example, when the university has business operations that generate revenue, let's say ticket sales at the Annenberg Theater or at the football stadium or parking and such, they do pay taxes on that income. It's called unrelated business income taxes. And in addition, the university owns properties, like, for example, the corridor on 40th Street, where they rent out those properties to for-profit companies and businesses, and that square footage of the property does pay property taxes, even though on the second floor of that strip is things like the animal services department, which is part of the university, and they don't pay taxes on that. So there's plenty of precedent for the university being able to segment off different aspects of its real estate, different aspects of its operations that don't fall under the 501c3 classification.
And I think this really gets to what I want to ask you next, which is, you're hinting at, and you've already also stated just a little bit ago, your proposal, you signed the Penn for Pilots pledge supporting the pilots' demand, But back in the September event, you also shared that you have a bit of a critique, which this is more of an interim measure and not a longer term solution. I think what you're laying out here is revisiting this tax code and raising some questions about the functions that you identify as not being tied to community benefit, like the dorms, like the dining hall facilities. These are not for public consumption or can be construed as for public use broadly. So I wonder if you want to expand at all about this sort of interim measure versus long-term solution.
Yeah, I think that my issue with the pilot's approach as it's been framed is that it's a voluntary contribution, and public agencies can't project their budgets based on voluntary contributions, which may or may not arrive. Whereas a change in the tax code would give a much firmer, basis on which to understand what is and is not going to be taxed and what the associated revenue would be. So, yeah, my suggestion was that the legislature might revisit this. Now, there are some, important implications. I think with Philadelphia, where property taxes are pretty low relative to the rest of the state, it would be within reason for the university to be able to pay this without a substantial surcharge on the students, for example. But I think once you get out to, these higher priced suburbs like Montgomery County, where property taxes are much, much higher, you would have to, there is that provision in the tax code that you could have payment in lieu of taxes negotiated between the county and, say, Villanova University or something. But this would be complicated, no doubt about it. There would be political pushback by the higher education industry for sure. But I think that through a combination of laws that are change in the tax code and a proviso for a negotiated agreement, based on the tax rate, that we could get somewhere.
So you had mentioned this idea of possible revisiting the tax code at the state level, and also said that back in August, the state legislature was considering reviewing and changing the tax exempt status or changing the rules around that. I wonder if anything has come of that you know of, and then does, thinking about the electoral shift that happened in November, if we might think that changes the outcome for this.
Well, so in August, there was a call for a study from the legislature, from one of the legislators. There was a call for a study of the tax exemption code. And whether that has proceeded, I'm unsure. I have not heard that study has proceeded. I do know that some of the faculty involved in the pilots initiative at Penn are exploring a possible lawsuit to challenge the code, on the basis that many of these activities don't meet the purpose of a nonprofit tax exemption. But I have not heard of anything progressing further. As to whether the legislature would take this up, I think it's an interesting question, and I don't know enough about the State House politics to know how that would go. But I could certainly imagine that, many of the representatives are in jurisdictions that would certainly benefit from a revisiting of this and bringing more into balance the obligations of these institutions, especially with regard to these activities that don't, serve a public benefit, but which nevertheless rely upon public services. The streets, the roads, the services and utilities, all these things that the public agencies are providing.
I think to me, it strikes me as a potentially sort of interesting possibility for strange bedfellows in supporting this. You mentioned that the higher ed industry is most likely to be opposed to this kind of revisiting. But I wonder, so the broad electoral shifts in November, some Democrats were hopeful in the election that they would be able to retake majorities in either the state houses of the legislature. They were unsuccessful in doing so and actually lost seats in the House. So still Republican majority in both of those bodies. But I'm wondering, is this something, given what you've said about some of the communities, not only in Philadelphia but other parts of the state, that actually might see this as an opportunity for increasing revenue, that we might actually find some ability to shift Republicans or some more conservative-leaning districts on this issue?
Yes, and in fact, I could see it as being, pretty bipartisan in some respects, in the sense that, the legislators are representing, localities where the local property tax base is crucial for funding things like education, and could benefit substantially from additional tax revenues. I would say, however, that I think that the basis of funding education primarily through property taxes is very unfair, and communities that have higher income residents and have higher property values, they're able to fund substantially greater enriched resources for education compared to a place like Philadelphia, where we have about a 25% poverty rate, and so it's our schools struggle, and we spend about half per pupil compared to what Montgomery County, for example, spends per pupil, or some of the school districts out there. So I think that the inequities and the attention on systemic racism should really have us revisiting the state-based formula for funding education overall. I mean, even beyond this conversation about how to treat the nonprofits. So
I'm curious, sort of moving here in the end of our conversation to thinking about next steps. Do you see this possible, I think you've proposed two legislative initiatives here in our conversation. One, revisiting the tax exemption code, and also two, revisiting the state-based formula for funding of education. How would you sort of recommend or advise those thinking about building a coalition around either of these ends to think about those? And then related to that, you mentioned the lawsuit. Do you think these are synonymous with a legal action or litigation, or these are really different types of effort? Well, certainly they're different. Litigation is a different process altogether. It might be a more straightforward way to challenge the tax exemption, to take it to court, because I think a legislative pathway is going to take a lot longer and is going to take a lot of time to build the legislative support. And of course, as we've discussed, there would be, significant political opposition, which is not the same as legal opposition. And I think that the odds might be stronger to go to court. But that remains to be seen what might happen there. But indeed, trying to do, either initiative at a legislative level is going to take coalition building. It will take bringing together. I think there's a lot of fairness in tax groups out there who are, not all of one political type, and who would recognize that, the substantial land holdings being untaxed by these organizations is unfair to the other taxpayers, including the private businesses who compete with the dining halls and the dormitories. We have lots of private landlords who are paying property tax, who house perhaps as many students as the colleges themselves are housing. So I think there's a coalition could be built across small businesses, across poverty, anti-poverty advocates, and a whole array of folks. It also strikes me that in this moment, when, we've heard this, I think some from the university over the course of the COVID pandemic, but also from the city more broadly, economic straits like we're in right now with the recession and the economy where it is, you hear lots of administrators and officials talking about austerity, and this presents an alternative funding stream to cutting back in very significant ways. I suppose to me, this was the greatest surprise of the Penn announcement personally, was that, it comes amidst a lot of university announcements of cutting back and needing to tighten the belt in a lot of different ways. And then we have this large grant and donation that's offered amidst that. It did reveal, I think, to the surprise of some, that
the university has these undesignated dollars, and that the president's office had such a flexible account for which it could commit these resources. I think that was a bit of a surprise to some people.
Certainly to me, and it sounds like to you as well.
Yes.
Well, maybe just a final question in closing. Zooming back to Philadelphia and to Penn more specifically, what do you think this means next? Where do we go next? Do you think Drexel and Jefferson, other large educational nonprofits in the city, are likely to follow suit? It seems like the time for that might have passed, but perhaps you think differently.
Well, I think that the other higher education institutions are also strapped. I don't think that they have these kind of discretionary dollars. Many are likely actually running deficits in this coming year because of the COVID crisis. So I think it's a particularly hard year for institutions that run on a much tighter budget than Penn to be able to voluntarily contribute. I would hope that in future years, when revenues are up, that they would consider making these kinds of contributions. But again, it does boil down to the fact that voluntary contributions are not ideal because they are voluntary, and these public agencies can't really budget their expenses based on unknown or voluntary revenue sources.
Great. Well, maybe I'll just prompt you again. Thinking, I threw a lot at you in that question. What would you say are next steps for us here at Penn in continuing this fight? I think for those interested in this, being engaged with possible coalitions around state level legislation or pending litigation are certainly places to look. Any other words of wisdom or advice that you would offer?
Well, this is not my specialty. I'm not a tax expert by any means. But I do think that an engaged student body, keeping watch on this issue, and the faculty who similarly are concerned about our, community responsibility, that, we should not be satisfied with only $10 million per year, although we can be grateful for that. And I think we should, look at the long game here and think about, using our collective interests to, try to mobilize politically around this. I think it will be a long haul, but I think that a coalition among people in our community is certainly possible.
Well, I think that's a fantastic note to end on. Dr. Culhane, let me just thank you again for being willing to join us and for this very interesting conversation. Your second time engaging with the Andrea Mitchell Center just this semester, and we're very grateful to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie.